Do you guys smell that? What is that? Oh, I know what it is. It's some more Gears of Lore. And some wild speculations about the origins of creatures that is sure to spark a massive amount of hate comments, which is exactly why I'm here. Long after the human-locust conflict, humanity was knocked back on its heels hard. Culture, ways of life, entire peoples all disappeared off the face of Serra through the course of numerous battles that took place. The species was just barely eking by, considering that it had wrapped up the Pendulum Wars, and then the next war was taking place, which was really more of just an eradication of humanity than it was just the conquering of the surface. Had the Locusts won, every man, woman, and child would have been obliterated by the Horde as the Locusts attempted to leave the Hollow in force due to the Lambent outbreak. While trying to save their own people, the way in which they approached the surface and humanity's prior taking of emulsion, and all the other terrible things that humanity was currently doing at this point in time, would lead to a wide-scale conflict, decreasing the population to the point that I would say almost was a genetic bottleneck. For a time though, there was peace following the activation of Adam Phoenix's machine. These waves permeated the planet and washed over the surface, taking out the emulsion in the creature's cell. This meant that the Lambent on the surface and within the Hollow itself simply melted away. The Locusts, who were largely infected but hadn't turned Lambent yet, fell to their knees and quickly met their end. After meeting this supposed end though, they would crystallize quickly, and the biggest issue with this crystallization was that it could not be easily broken. Humanity would attempt to clean up after the war, so there weren't just, a ton of Locust pods around, so they chose to put them down in the spent osmium mines, and there they stayed for over 20 years. This time of peace allowed humanity to somewhat turn back towards its former glory. Well, that might be a little much actually. Not so much the former glory as just attempting to repopulate the planet and build any structure they could. Everyone was actually spread pretty thin. Some cities were obviously more successful than others, but the infrastructure just wasn't there anymore, and there was no need for such infrastructure anyhow, as there were no humans to populate these walled cities in any great capacity. That said, small bands of outliers existed, dotting the map on the Seran surface with small outposts. These outposts, though, were quite isolated. And that's why an issue would arise for the remaining Serans: sheer distance and isolation from one another. These groups usually chose to avoid Cog settlements even if their family was originally part of the Cog. The reason was, at this point, the Cog was becoming more and more, shall we say, tyrannical in their approach. They wanted to get humanity back on their feet and back in power, but they would tread down some shady paths to do so. Seemingly, this is what ended Anya after James was born. And then, out of nowhere, people began to go missing on a large scale. It wasn't just the small outposts of Stranded that had issues, however. Inside the Cog cities, or at least around the outskirts, it's known that many people would just disappear with little to no evidence as to what became of them or what happened concerning their fate. This began to spark massive distrust between not only the outposts with other outposts, but the Cog with these outposts, and then subsequently these outposts with the Cog. Everybody thought everybody else was kidnapping their people. This would ultimately culminate in attacks on outposts, where Chairman Jin would arrive robot style and accuse everyone of stealing their people. What humanity wouldn't notice is, as they were falling right back into war with one another, like they had always done in their history, is that this wasn't just a human issue of abduction, but a Locust one. Deep underground, the Locust, after entering a state of metamorphosis, much like how a butterfly does entering its chrysalis, the swarm would wake back up, reformed and renewed. Their bodies having become destroyed after the emulsion in them was destroyed, they would break out of these crystals and begin their abduction process. This abduction required a human host and their subsequent subjugation. Placed inside of nests and pods, they would be melted down in their own form of metamorphosis and then rebuilt. In fact, if you would like to see a video on that, I will link it at the end. I'm pretty proud of that video, more so because I had to fight the yellow symbol of ridiculous nonsense for about 4 days just to get it uploaded. Regardless, as a human is melted down, they will become a juvenile, which isn't a fully formed but still capable of attacking creature, much like how a wretch would. In cases of enough cooking time being made available, this would lead to a standard drone. These drones were powerful and gave the military a run for their money as the nightmare was reawakened and humanity once again would have to fight these monsters to stay alive. That said, the abduction process became more and more aggressive as time went on. Initially, only a few people here and there would really go missing, which would only galvanize their immediate friends and family to begin searches, but eventually entire towns would go missing. As the swarm began to build in strength, they would become more bold in their approaches. Eventually, we see how they were just snatching humans in the blink of an eye. During an attack on Kate's settlement, many of the people would be grabbed and taken off by creatures who would disappear almost before you could even register they were there. So, pretty long intro on this one, but I've been kind of enjoying those. So today, it's obvious who and what we are talking about, the Snatcher from the Swarm. We will also be discussing what they do, their evolutionary path, as well as possibly how they may be interfacing with the human body to keep them subdued. Alright, let's get to it. So first and foremost, what is a Snatcher? Well, a Snatcher is a creature that is quite adept at stalking humans, whether they be military or civilian. They are relatively good at planning and are able to move so fast that it's hard for people to keep track of them. Not only that, but they can possess the ability to climb quickly, which means they can exit combat exceedingly fast. Say if you are in a courtyard trying to take one out with a grenade, but you don't notice notice that other one on the roof right next to you. Good lord, Marcus, old age really is getting to you, isn't it? As the creature descends upon Marcus, we get a pretty good idea of what happens to a person should they be in the path of this thing. In Gears of War 4, we specifically, as stated, see Marcus get the tentacles wrapped around his neck and body, almost completely immobilizing him. Upon doing so, it draws him into the abdomen area of this creature, which houses kind of like a holding sack, which is kind of a gross statement. After reaching a safe location, the pod will be created for a person and they will be melted down. However, once in the pod, they will be connected to the swarm's hive mind and have their consciousness fused with the others and ultimately to whoever is in charge. Now, we know who's in charge, but just in case, I won't come right out and say it because no spoilers. Luckily, concerning Marcus, he is found in time to negate this melting, but basically everyone else is not so lucky. I mean, literally break open any pod you find and it's just a mass of limbs. This is not to say though, this is the only thing the Snatcher can do before it grabs people. Should a person be heavily armored or fighting back effectively, a quill can be charged up and shot out. This quill has the capability of piercing osmium armor and immediately putting down a cog soldier onto the ground, which we have seen firsthand because I suck at this game. The quill is theorized to contain some sort of sedative or paralyzing agent within it, and I just want to point out I was really good at Gears of War 1 and 2, terrible at Gears 4 and 5. Likely this quill is coated in a type of neurotoxin. Essentially, when this neurotoxin enters the body, it is capable of disrupting the nerve signals to the skeletal muscle of the body specifically, but does not go deep enough to stop the heart. When it does, the body is rendered paralyzed to a degree, making it incredibly tough for a person to run away, and instead, they're forced to crawl, which makes them easily picked up. With that said, this quill is fired at a ridiculously high velocity as it raises its tail, and when it does, to those not wearing armor, if they were to say to be hit center mass or in the head, it could likely easily rupture the human skull due to the force behind it, which immediately destroys the brain in the process, or it could stop the heart because it goes too deep, leaving the person to flatline. Ultimately, this creature would want to avoid hitting these fatal areas if at all possible, and for the most part, due to the success that they've had in abductions, it would be necessary to avoid these areas, but they don't always have to use the quill anyways. So let's discuss for a moment what happens to your meat suit as you're abducted. It would appear to me that after the neurotoxin enters the body, the initial result is the neuron signal disruption that we have discussed before and how it stops your muscles from contracting. However, even this being the case, your heart is still beating and the toxin is pushed around the body. As it is, it would probably have a more profound effect on your body the longer it's in there. For one thing, paralyzing the breathing muscle known as the diaphragm, which is under voluntary as well as involuntary control, would be detrimental to anyone who has been snagged. Which, by the way, since we're talking about breathing, you are now manually breathing. Because if I have to sit here and read this all while manually breathing, you have to feel my pain as well. And this is where I'm going to see a deep dive in my analytics. So as the toxin makes its way around, clearly the paralysis of muscle would spell the end for this person. Well, the Snatcher has an answer for that. It would seem that while on the inside of this creature, a type of tentacle is shoved down your throat and into your trachea to manually take over breathing, likely becoming an offshoot of the breathing that the creature is already doing. This is imperative as when this toxin sets in, it needs to keep you alive, but also it may continually administer a little bit of the toxin to keep the person in a state of sedation so they do not resist or clear the toxin within the Snatcher's body and then sort of cut their way out, considering they have chainsaws on their handhelds. So we have seen when Marcus is released from his pod, it takes a moment for the paralysis to wear off, which would seem quite normal. The body is likely just barely getting enough to keep it in a state of sedation in a way that when it's finally cut off, the body quickly clears it. We also see that when Kate is abducted, she's able to interface with the hive in a more profound way, which we all know why this is, but even while on the inside, she is subdued despite trying to fight it moments ago. When released, the toxin then quickly wears off as she runs back to the village to see what she did. So I suspect overall the person is administered this toxin within the abdomen of the Snatcher due to what we see when cog soldiers willingly allow themselves to be abducted by the Snatcher. Not only does this creature not immediately fire a quill into them, showing actually it does have some restraint and that it only uses this when it has to fight, but it abducts them and knocks them out, meaning that on the inside, the poison may be affecting them. They wake up next inside of a pod and then cut their way out. This would indicate that the piece of machinery that they use contains some sort of antitoxin to specifically the Snatchers and is on a time delay that wakes them up before they become completely melted by the concoction they are contained in. After removing the long tube and rebreather likely from their throats, they are ready to rock and burn the whole nest down. So getting a look at these creatures, they should definitely remind you of something concerning their evolution, but before getting there, you know where we actually have to start since it's been a hot minute. Starting with the feet, we see these creatures are quadrupedal now, possessing singular points on the front feet and back feet. They're almost kind of crab-like in appearance of how the foot is structured. Really, they are just kind of straight up pointers. Flanking each side of the foot is an exoskeleton that we can see on the other beast-like creatures associated with the swarm. And moving further up the leg, we can see that there is a joint connecting to the lowest segment, which then becomes part of the middle segment. The middle segment appears to be roughly as long as the lower segment and contains its own set of armor. However, it does not appear as robust as the lower set. The back legs are roughly about the same as the front in terms of length and connection points. However, the upper portions will be longer than the back's upper portions. And if that isn't a confusing statement, I don't know what it is. These arms and legs run into the torso of this creature, with the back legs running into a pelvic connection. You know, like humans or really any other animals that we would have. On the shoulders around the back of the upper arms exists some armor to protect it, but most of the armor resides on the back of the Snatcher to protect its back from any damage that you can put downrange. Highly effective at stopping energetic blasts or direct fire, these creatures do not have much fear of anything that might descend upon it. The abdomen of this creature is obviously where the moneymaker is, and that sounds messed up. The abdomen is clearly split into two sections. You have the section where the intestines are likely housed, which lie in the gray area of the skin and are protected by the armor above, and then the secondary section where the prey is brought into and abducted. This section appears red in coloring, which would indicate that it is relatively a thin membranous material and likely houses a lot of the creature's blood as a result. It's entirely possible that this membrane may actually act as some sort of gas exchange like breathing, which can provide the extra oxygen required to keep the prey alive inside the stomach so that the lungs do not have to work as hard when they abduct somebody. The face of this creature is just butt ugly, possessing beady little red eyes and almost a Krogan-like cranial armoring. Its mouth possesses many tentacles and razor-sharp teeth, showing that if it does get into a situation where it would have to bite, likely it could do a lot of damage to a person and even sever limbs. Moving back to the tail of this creature, it's quite important that this is its main form of attack. Should a person be far enough away or actively fighting, this creature can fire a quill soaked in a possible neurotoxin to subdue them. This quill will also be replaced shortly after, and this may indicate that multiple quills are located within the tail itself. However, they would definitely be finite in reality. If you were able to outlast the barrage of these, or just get lucky and they hit the walls, eventually this creature would have to use another method, but even with that said, the tentacles are difficult to out-grapple, especially with only your two arms. After entering a short refractory period concerning its tail, however, this creature can once again fire a quill at its discretion to continue the fight, or it can choose to completely outmaneuver a normal person and escape up the side of a building or into the woods. Getting a good look at its general morphology of these creatures, we can determine a point of evolution and its initial origins as well. You may or may not be surprised to know that a pouncer is actually a juvenile form of the Snatcher. It's all there if you look closely. Much like the pouncer with its multiple tentacles in its mouth, so too does the Snatcher have this. It's also no surprise that the stomach on the pouncer is the same coloring as the Snatcher, and the creature is quadrupedal as well. The quills within the pouncer's membranous tail, however, eventually fold in when the armor is lost. This will result in the formation of one large quill. The arms and legs lose their fingers and toes, which will be replaced by one long sharp point used for walking instead. Ironically, even though smaller, it seems that the adult form of this evolutionary line is more susceptible to damage, although its size, I reckon, would help it maybe a little bit. So looking at this, where do these creatures come from? Well, considering the locust didn't just go away after Adam's machine was set off, it's pretty clear to me that these creatures likely experienced the same thing after the machine bathed the planet in anti-emulsion measures. Any creature native to the Hollow likely had an infection of emulsion within their cells, and should they have not already been turned lambent, then they too likely entered a state of metamorphosis. So who's the progenitor of this thing? Well, to me, it's clearly a reaver. While not confirmed in the lore, it's pretty obvious if you look at it. The body shape of a reaver and Snatcher are incredibly similar, the larger front end comprising roughly 70% of the overall body mass, and the back end being tapered. Also, you may be shocked to learn that reavers do in fact have tails. These tails end with sharp bony protrusions, but it's tough to get a good look at it because usually it's just trying to blow you up. Now, the reaver does in fact have 3 limbs coming from the same connection point. However, it has front arms in 3 segments, and also those end with a more pointed appearance that we see like on the Snatchers. The head of these creatures has been modified during its time undergoing metamorphosis, but ultimately what a reaver looks like is simply a Snatcher that can fly. Not to mention those long legs mean that likely this creature was more adapted to running and eventually was equipped with the ability to fly due to locust technology. We see though this creature is no stranger to tentacles within its body, which we can infer that in the genetic coding there are genes coding for this. So what happened? The Reaper entered a state much like the locust did. As it changed, 2 sets of tentacles were instead internalized in this creature, which became mini tentacles. The creature can then use these after opening up the abdomen to grab humans and pull them inside. This left 1 set of tentacles to become the back legs and the front arms to grow larger. The body shape remained relatively the same at adulthood that we see between the two. The jaw would have likely needed to become smaller as the underbite isn't as pronounced, and the tail increased in length to be used more offensively, which, considered they ended in bony protrusions as mentioned previously, isn't too far-fetched to think that maybe that could happen. Makes you kind of wonder, doesn't it? Was the creature at the end of Gears of War 5 nothing but a Brumak that underwent metamorphosis as well.